The Baldwin brothers thought it was funny when they found the old man's keepsake. "Look here, boys," Buck Baldwin laughed, dangling the worn blue flag. "Grandpa's still crying over the war." The stranger at the bar didn't move, didn't turn, just watched in the mirror as young Billy Baldwin took the flag, the one that had covered his son's coffin at Gettysburg, and spat on it. Only the bartender recognized those dead, cold eyes. He'd seen them in a wanted poster years ago, the eyes of John Deadeye McGraw, the man who'd killed 37 gunmen in 9 states. The deadliest gunslinger west of the Mississippi was about to paint Copper Creek red. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 days earlier, John McGraw rode into Copper Creek on a dust-colored mare, his arrival marked only by the lazy barking of a few street dogs and the quiet whispers of townsfolk who'd learned to study strangers. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the town's single main street, where wagons had carved deep ruts into the hard-packed earth. McGraw's appearance hardly matched his reputation. Silver threads dominated his dark hair, and time had etched deep lines around his eyes. His black duster bore the patched holes of old bullet wounds, and he carried himself with the slight stiffness of a man who'd taken too many injuries to move with his younger grace. Only his eyes, sharp and watchful as a hawk's, betrayed the lethal skill that had made him a legend. The town itself wore the desperate look of a place dying slowly. Boarded windows marked failed businesses, and the painted signs above the remaining shops had faded to ghost-like shadows of their former vibrancy. Even the saloon, usually the heart of any frontier town, seemed subdued, its swinging doors moving listlessly in the hot breeze. McGraw dismounted outside Whitaker's general store, his boots raising small puffs of dust. Inside, old Tom Whitaker looked up from his ledger, his rheumy eyes widening slightly at the sight of the armed stranger. "Help you, mister?" Whitaker's hand drifted toward the shotgun he kept under the counter. "Coffee. Ammunition for a Colt 45. McGraw's voice was quiet, roughened by years of trail dust. "And information, if you're selling that too." Whitaker's hand moved away from the shotgun. Something in the stranger's manner, not threatening, but carrying the weight of absolute certainty, told him this wasn't a man to fear unless you gave him reason. "What kind of information you looking for?" "Baldwin family. Heard they've taken an interest in local businesses." Whitaker's face tightened. He glanced at the window, then back at McGraw. "Might want to be careful asking about them. They've got friends in the sheriff's office, and enemies tend to have accidents." McGraw nodded, as if this confirmed something he already knew. "Tell me about the accidents." Over the next hour, Whitaker painted a picture of systematic terror. The Baldwins had arrived 6 months ago. 7 brothers led by the eldest, Buck. They'd started small, protection money from saloons, fixing card games. Then came the accidents. A stable fire that killed 3 horses, a rancher's wife thrown from her spooked horse, a merchant found beaten in an alley. "Sheriff Wade does nothing?" McGraw asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Wade's either bought or scared. Maybe both." Whitaker's voice dropped lower. "Last month, Harry Chen, he ran the laundry, tried standing up to them. They burned his place down with him inside. Called it a tragic accident with Chinese lanterns." McGraw's eyes narrowed slightly, the only visible reaction to the story. He paid for his supplies with precise movements, each coin placed deliberately on the counter. "One more thing," he said. "Need a room. Somewhere quiet. Martana's boarding house, end of town. She's particular about her guests, but—" Whitaker studied McGraw's face. "Tell her Tom sent you." The boarding house stood apart from the other buildings, its weathered, clapboard walls painted a faded blue that had once been cheerful. Martha Tanner herself answered McGraw's knock, a tall, stern-faced woman with iron-grey hair and eyes that had seen enough of the world to judge a man quickly. She took in his worn clothes, the gun worn low on his hip, the way he continuously scanned his surroundings. But it was the folded flag in his coat pocket that seemed to decide her. $3 a week, she said. Meals included. No drinking, no women, no trouble. McGraw nodded. Won't be here long. They never are, she replied, but led him to a small room at the back of the house, its window offering a clear view of both the street and the stable where he'd housed his mare. That evening, he sat in the corner of the town's only restaurant, watching. The Baldwins were creatures of habit, like most bullies. They owned the saloon across the street, and every evening they'd parade through town, making their presence felt. He counted them as they swaggered past the window. Buck, the eldest, built like a bull and twice as mean. Jed and Caleb, the twins, quick with their guns and quicker to anger. Tom and Billy, the youngest, trying to prove themselves as vicious as their older brothers. And Frank, the quiet one, the most dangerous of them all. The waitress, a tired-looking woman named Sarah, brought him his coffee without him asking. "You're watching them," she said quietly, "like others have, men who thought they could change things." And what happened to those men? Some died, some left, some just disappeared. She glanced at the saloon. My husband was one of them, Deputy Marshal James Connor. Came here tracking stolen army payroll, found the Baldwins instead. McGraw's eyes met hers. When? 3 months ago. They never found his body. He nodded once slowly, added another piece to the puzzle he was building. That night, lying on the hard boarding house bed, McGraw cleaned his Colt with practiced precision. The pearl grips were worn smooth by years of use, and the bluing had worn off the barrel in places, but the action was pristine. Like its owner, the gun's age masked its deadliness. He thought about the stories he'd heard. The burned laundry, the missing marshal, a town slowly dying under the boot of 7 brothers who mistook cruelty for strength. And he thought about another town, years ago, where he'd faced down similar men. Before the war, before he lost his son, before he became the person whispered about around campfires. Tomorrow he'd begin, quietly, carefully, learning their patterns, finding their weaknesses, building the trap that would end them. But first, he needed coffee. News traveled fast in Copper Creek. By morning, whispers about the silver-haired stranger had already reached the sheriff's office. Wade sat behind his scarred desk, listening to his deputy's report while cleaning his revolver with mechanical precision. Calls himself John Smith, Deputy Peters said, shifting nervously. Took a room at Martana's. Wade's hands stilled. Description? Tall, lean, cavalry saber scar down his face. Carries a Colt with pearl grips. The sheriff's face paled slightly. Get me the wanted posters from '68, the ones from the Kansas Territory. The yellowed broadsheet confirmed his fears. The sketch showed a younger man, but the scar was unmistakable. The text below read, "Wanted for questioning, John Deadeye. McGraw, in connection with the deaths of the Harper gang, approach with extreme caution." "Jesus," Peters whispered, "that's him, the one they call the Ghost Marshal." Wade nodded grimly. 12 years ago, he rode with the 3rd Cavalry, led a special unit hunting deserters and raiders. After the war, he kept hunting, anywhere he found. Men preying on the weak. He tapped the poster. They say he killed the entire Harper gang, 8 men by himself. That's impossible. Tell that to the Harpers. Wade leaned back. Story goes they killed his son at Gettysburg, Confederate sharpshooter. After that, something in McGraw broke. Or maybe it just hardened. He started hunting bad men, not for bounties, not for glory, just hunting. Across town, McGraw sat in Whitaker's store again, listening to more stories. The old-timer had lived in Copper Creek for 20 years, seen it grow from a mining camp to a proper town. Now he watched it die. "Wasn't always like this," Whitaker said, arranging cans of beans with arthritic hands. "We had dreams. Railway was. Coming through. Copper mine was producing. Then the Baldwins showed up. Tell me about the mine. Closed now. Cave-in killed 3 men. Another accident. Whitaker's voice dripped bitterness. Buck Baldwin offered to buy it cheap after that. Owner refused. Next day someone shot his horses. All of them. McGraw's eyes narrowed. The railway? Survey crew got robbed. Twice. Company decided to route through Preston's Creek instead. He glanced at McGraw, 20 miles west, where the Baldwins just happened to buy land last year. The pieces were fitting together, not just simple bullies. The Baldwins were systematically strangling the town, forcing people to sell cheap, controlling everything worth controlling. The bell above the door chimed. Sarah Connor entered, her waitress uniform replaced by simple work clothes. She carried herself differently now, straighter, more purposeful. "Mr. McGraw," she said quietly, "we need to talk about my husband." They walked to the cemetery, where she stopped before an empty plot. They say he ran off, abandoned his badge. Her fingers traced the small marker. James would never run. He was close. Had evidence about the army payroll. Said the Baldwins were working with someone bigger, someone with connections. McGraw studied her face. "You have his papers," she nodded. "Hidden, been waiting for someone who could finish what he started." A horse's whinny interrupted them. Frank Baldwin rode past the cemetery, his cold, eyes taking in the scene. Sarah stiffened. "That's the one," she whispered. "The one who led James into the hills. Said they had a witness about the payroll." McGraw watched Frank disappear around the corner. Of all the brothers, Frank was the thinker, the planner. The others might carry out the violence, but Frank directed it. The day grew hotter. McGraw spent it walking the town, mapping sightlines, noting escape routes. He counted 11 empty buildings, 4 recent graves, a dozen freshly posted foreclosure notices. At the saloon he listened. The Baldwin's men talked freely after a few drinks. He learned their habits. Buck liked to play. Cards on Wednesdays. The twins practiced shooting behind the old mill. Billy and Tom watched the stable, waiting to collect fees from travelers, but it was what they didn't say that interested him most. The way they fell silent when certain topics came up. The furtive meetings at midnight. The mysterious riders, who came from the east once a month. Someone was backing the Baldwins, someone with money and influence. The dead marshal had been right about that. As evening approached, McGraw returned to Ma Tanner's. She met him at the door, her face tight. With worry, "Sheriff Wade was here," she said. "Asking questions." McGraw nodded. "Expected that. He knows who you are." She hesitated. "What you've done?" "Most of those stories are lies. And the true ones?" His eyes met hers. "Are worse." She studied him for a long moment, then stepped aside to let him enter. "Dinner's at 6. I made extra biscuits." In his room, McGraw added to his mental map of the town. The Baldwins were careful, professional, but they'd made one critical mistake. They'd gotten comfortable, confident, started believing their own legend. He'd seen it before, in other towns, with other men who thought their cruelty made them invincible. Men who forgot that legends cut both ways, and John McGraw had become a legend for a reason. Buck Baldwin's laughter boomed through the saloon like cannon fire. He'd just won another hand of poker, as he always did on Wednesday nights. Across the table, Marcus Webb, the town's only doctor, stared at his lost money with hollow eyes. "Looks like you're short on funds again, Doc," Buck sneered, cleaning his nails with a Bowie knife. "But I'm feeling generous, double or nothing, against that new German medical kit of yours." Webb's hands trembled. "I need that for my patients, and your patients need you alive." Buck's smile never reached his eyes. "Your choice." From his corner table, McGraw watched the inevitable unfold. Webb would play, would lose. And another piece of Copper Creek would fall under Baldwin control. The doctor's shoulders slumped as Buck dealt the cards. Outside, the twins, Jed and Caleb, supervised the weekly protection collection. They moved from business to business, their very presence a threat. Most paid quietly. Those who hesitated were treated to demonstrations of the twins' skill with their matching nickel-plated Remingtons. "Remember old Chen?" Jed would ask, spinning his revolver. "Shame about that fire." McGraw noted how they worked. Jed did the talking, Caleb watched the street. They alternated positions, never leaving themselves exposed. Military training or something close to it. At the general store, Whitaker counted out his payment with shaking hands. Not from fear, from rage. Each coin represented another piece of his dignity stripped away. "Bit short this week, old man," Caleb observed. "Droughts affected business, people ain't buying." Jed's hand shot out, catching Whitaker's shirt front. "Ain't our problem. Make up the difference by Sunday. Or maybe we'll have ourselves a midnight fire sale." As they left, McGraw saw Whitaker's grandson watching from the back room, his young face twisted with helpless anger. Another seed of rebellion, planted by Baldwin cruelty. The afternoon brought more examples of their control. Frank Baldwin supervised the loading of crates onto a wagon behind the saloon, crates that clinked with the sound of bottles but weighed too much to be mere whiskey. Tom and Billy Baldwin intercepted a traveling salesman at the stable, explaining the new road tax with matching grins and ready guns. But it was at dusk that McGraw witnessed the true depth of their power. A rider came in from the east, expensive. Clothes, clean-shaven, carrying saddlebags that bulged with papers. He went straight to the saloon's back room. 10 minutes later, Sheriff Wade arrived, then the town banker. A private meeting that lasted an hour. When they emerged, Wade looked sick, the banker looked defeated, and the stranger rode out with a satisfied smile. "That's Mr. Smith," Sarah Connor whispered, refilling McGraw's coffee. "Comes once a month. After his visits, more foreclosure notices go up." McGraw's eyes narrowed. "Bank loans, modified terms, impossible payments. Then the Baldwins offer to buy the property for pennies." Her hand shook slightly. "James was tracking the money. Said it led to someone in the territorial government." The pieces clicked together. Not just thugs with guns. The Baldwins were frontmen for something bigger. A land grab scheme backed by political power. As night fell, Buck Baldwin stood on the saloon's porch, surveying his domain. Dr. Webb stumbled past, his medical kit gone, a bottle clutched in his shaking hand. Whitaker closed his store early, the weight of debt heavy on his shoulders, and the townspeople hurried home, avoiding the Baldwin brothers' eyes. In her boarding house, Martana locked her doors and windows. "Used to be, we only did that for Indians and bandits," she told McGraw. "Now we do it for the men who claim to own the town." McGraw cleaned his Colt with methodical precision. Man can only own what he can hold on to. She studied him carefully. "You've seen this before?" Different towns, different names, same story. He checked the cylinder's action. Men who mistake fear for respect, power for right. And how do those stories end? His eyes met hers in the lamplight. Badly, for them. In the street below, Billy Baldwin staggered from the saloon, drunk and looking for entertainment. His gaze fell on the Chinese laundress hurrying home with her day's earnings. McGraw's hand tightened on his gun. "Not yet," Martana said softly. "Much as we'd all like to see it." He forced himself to watch as the woman paid her toll and scurried away. Forced himself to remember that timing was everything. Tomorrow he'd take his coffee at the saloon counter. Tomorrow he'd let young Billy Baldwin make the mistake of touching that folded flag. Tomorrow Copper Creek would learn why some legends weren't just stories. The morning sun hadn't yet burned the chill from Copper Creek's streets when McGraw took his place at the saloon counter. Behind him, The Baldwin brothers were already deep in their cups, celebrating another successful collection day. Sam Miller, the bartender, set coffee before McGraw without being asked. His hands shook slightly. He'd seen enough bar fights to recognize the tension building in the air. "Mighty quiet for a hard man," Buck Baldwin called out, whiskey making him bold. McGraw didn't respond, didn't turn, just sipped his coffee, watching. The brother's reflection in the bar mirror. "Asked you a question, old-timer." Buck's chair scraped back. Miller retreated to the far end of the bar. The few other morning patrons found urgent business elsewhere, leaving only the Baldwins, McGraw, and the thick tension between them. "Ain't polite to ignore folks," Jed added, fingering his gun belt, "especially in their own establishment." McGraw set his cup down with deliberate care. "Not your establishment, not yet." The words hung in the air like gun smoke. Buck's face reddened. "Reckon you don't know who you're talking to." 6 brothers, former Confederate irregulars, turned outlaws. "After Appomattox." McGraw's voice was casual, almost bored. "Wanted in 3 states for murder, robbery, and cowardice." The twins' hands dropped to their guns. Tom and Billy spread out, flanking positions they'd practiced dozens of times. Only Frank held back, studying McGraw with calculating eyes. "That's a hanging accusation," Buck growled. "Best apologize. Noticed you don't deny the cowardice part." McGraw turned slightly, giving them their first clear look at the saber scar. "Like when you butchered those settlers near Fort Smith. Women and children. Real brave." Billy, drunk and stupid, made his move then, grabbed for the folded flag in McGraw's coat pocket. "What's this?" Some kind of the next 3 seconds burned themselves into Copper Creek's memory forever. McGraw's hand moved like a ratless strike, caught Billy's wrist, twisted. The crack of breaking bone was followed by the younger Baldwin's scream. Before the sound died, McGraw had already drawn and fired twice from the hip. Jed and Caleb's matching Remingtons never cleared leather. They collapsed with identical looks of surprise, twin bullet holes where their hearts had been. Tom managed to draw, managed to aim. McGraw's 3rd shot took him through the throat. Buck roared, charging forward like the bull he resembled. McGraw's 4th shot shattered his knee. The giant crashed into the bar, scattering glasses. Only Frank remained, standing, his hands carefully away from his guns. His eyes met McGraw's in the mirror. "You're him," Frank said softly. "The ghost marshal, the one they sent after deserters." "Still sending me after deserters." McGraw's gun hadn't moved. "And murderers, and cowards." Billy writhed on the floor, cradling his shattered wrist. Buck tried to reach for his fallen gun, but McGraw's boot pinned his hand to the floorboards. 4 dead, Frank assessed coolly. "Quick work." 3 dead, McGraw corrected. 1 crippled, 1 broken, and you. The Colt's hammer cocked with a sound like destiny, walking away, for now, to deliver a message. "What message?" "Copper Creek is under new management." Frank nodded once, back toward the door. "They'll send more men. I'll send back more bodies." The morning sun painted Frank's shadow long across the saloon floor as he left. He didn't look back at his fallen brothers. Didn't hurry. Just walked away, already planning his next move. Sam Miller emerged from behind the bar, looking at the carnage with wide eyes. "Sweet Jesus, you killed the Baldwins." "Some of them." McGraw holstered his Colt. The entire exchange had taken less than 10 seconds. "Get the sheriff and the undertaker." Buck Baldwin glared up from the floor, his ruined knee leaking blood between his fingers. "You're dead, you son of a bitch." "When word gets back to—" McGraw's boot caught him under the jaw, cutting off the threat. "Word's already on its way. So are more men with guns and badges they bought, coming to die in Copper Creek." He retrieved his fallen flag, carefully brushed off the dust, and returned it to his pocket. "Might want to order more coffins, Sam. Getting a feeling we'll need them." Sheriff Wade found his courage in a bottle. He burst into the saloon an hour after the shooting, whiskey on his breath and 6 deputies at his back. The bodies still lay where they fell, blood turning black on the sawdust floor. McGraw hadn't. Moved from the bar. Just ordered another coffee. John McGraw. Wade's voice cracked slightly. You're under arrest for murder. Self-defense. McGraw didn't turn. 20 witnesses saw them draw first. 19, Sam Miller corrected from behind. The bar. Mrs. Chen fainted. Wade's hand trembled on his gun. 4 men dead. 3. McGraw sipped his coffee. Buck still breathing, unfortunately. As if to confirm this, Buck Baldwin groaned from his place on the floor. Doc Webb knelt beside him, examining the shattered knee. He'll never walk right. Again, Webb announced, a hint of satisfaction in his voice, even if he lives through the fever that's coming. Billy Baldwin huddled in the corner, cradling his broken wrist, his young face twisted with pain and hate. The bravado that had led him to grab the flag was gone, replaced by the look of a boy who just discovered the world was harder than he'd imagined. You can't just... Wade started. Did. McGraw finally turned. Now you've got 2 choices. Sheriff, arrest me, start a fight you can't win, or help restore some law to this town. The deputies shifted nervously. They'd seen the results of McGraw's work. 4 men cut down before they could properly draw. None of them wanted to test their speed against his. Wade's shoulders slumped. Frank Baldwin rode east. He's got friends, powerful ones. I know. They'll send men, professionals. I know that too. The undertaker arrived with his wagon. Young Billy watched, weeping, as his brothers were carried out. Buck cursed weakly as Webb's assistants lifted him onto a stretcher. Outside, a crowd had gathered. McGraw heard their whispers, felt the mix of fear and hope in their voices. They'd lived so long under Baldwin terror that freedom felt dangerous. Sarah Connor pushed through the onlookers, her eyes fixed on McGraw. Is it true? Did you kill them? He nodded once, her hand cracked across his face. Then she hugged him fiercely. Thank you, she whispered. James would have. Whitaker arrived, leaning on his cane. Frank Baldwin stopped by the store before he left town, said to tell you something. McGraw waited, said, tall trees, 63, said you'd understand. The coffee cup cracked in McGraw's grip. Only Sam Miller, watching closely, saw the flash of emotion cross his face. What happened at Tall Trees? Wade asked. Massacre. McGraw's voice was flat. Deserters hit a wagon train, killed everyone, men, women, children. We hunted them down. Frank Baldwin was one of them, only one that escaped. Understanding dawned. In Wade's eyes, that's why you're here. You've been hunting him all along. Part of why. McGraw set down the broken cup. Rest doesn't matter, but it did matter. Word spread through Copper Creek like wildfire. By sunset, everyone knew the story. The ghost marshal hadn't randomly drifted into town. He'd been following Frank Baldwin's trail for 12 years. The Baldwins' reign of terror might be broken, but something worse was coming. Frank would return with an army of gunmen, and Copper Creek would become a battlefield. Some families packed their wagons that night. Others hung signs on their doors, closed until further notice. The smart ones, the cautious ones, prepared to flee, but not everyone ran. Doc Webb stayed, his German medical kit restored to its place of honor. Whitaker kept his store open, shotgun close at hand. Sarah Connor served coffee with her head held high, and Ma Tanner baked extra biscuits. They'd lived too long under Baldwin rule, tasted too much fear. Now, with McGraw standing like a weather-beaten lighthouse in their storm, they found their courage again. In the saloon, Sam Miller swept up bullet fragments and scrubbed blood from the floorboards. He paused when he found Billy Baldwin's spilled beer, the puddle still holding the reflection of that terrible morning. You think they're really coming? He asked McGraw. All of them? Yes. How many? McGraw checked his Colt's load, an action, as natural as breathing. Doesn't matter, numbers don't mean much in a killing field. Is that what Copper Creek's going to be? Already is. McGraw's eyes met Miller's in the bar mirror. Has been since the Baldwins first arrived. Difference is, now the dying will happen faster, and this time the right people will do the dying. Outside, the desert wind moaned like a hungry ghost. Somewhere east of town, Frank Baldwin was already gathering his forces. Somewhere in the territorial capital, corrupt officials were writing orders and signing papers. The storm was coming to Copper Creek, and John McGraw meant to paint the town. Read before it ended. They came at midnight, 3 days after the saloon shooting. 12 riders, dressed in black, moving without lights. Professional manhunters led by a scarred Mexican named Cortez, who'd made his reputation killing Apache scouts. McGraw was waiting. He'd spent those 3 days preparing, reading the land like a book written in dust and shadow. Every approach to town, every blind spot, every place men might hide, he knew them all. The hunters split into 3 groups, just as he'd expected. 4 men watching the livery stable, thinking he'd try to run. 4 covering the boarding house, where they thought he slept. 4 moving up the main street, ready to flush him out. They found his mare in the stable, saddled and ready. Found his gun belt hanging in his boarding house room. Found his coffee cup still warm on the saloon counter. What they didn't find was him. The first shot came from the church steeple, where no one ever thought to look. Cortez's second in command toppled from his saddle, a hole where his left eye had been. Before his body hit the ground, McGraw had already shifted position. There! One of the hunters spotted the muzzle flash. 6 guns turned toward the steeple. Guo. Next shot came from behind them. 2 more hunters fell, their guns unfired. McGraw had vanished again, a ghost in the darkness, leaving only corpses to mark his passing. He's playing with us, Cortez growled in Spanish. Spread out, find him. They tried. Professionals all, they moved, building by building, covering each other with practiced skill. But McGraw had spent 12 years hunting men like these, knew how they thought, how they moved. A shadow detached itself from an alley. Another hunter. It died, damn you! Cortez fired at the movement, his bullets striking empty air. Face me like a man! 8 years with the Apache scouts, McGraw's voice seemed to come from everywhere. And you still haven't learned. There's no honor in a fair fight. Another shot, another body. The remaining hunters bunched together, backs to a wall, eyes straining against the darkness. 7 of their number were down. They hadn't landed a single hit in return. Who are you? One of them whispered, fear cracking his voice. You didn't ask that before taking Frank Baldwin's money, McGraw answered from the shadows. Didn't ask what he did to deserve hunting. Didn't ask about the families he killed. Cortez spun, firing at the voice. His bullet shattered a window. Answering silence just took his gold, McGraw continued from a new position. Like you took gold to hunt other men, to kill for profit. Another shot. Another hunter fell. Please, the youngest one begged. We'll leave. Just let us. McGraw's bullet took him mid-word. Cortez stood alone now, his back to the saloon wall, gun rotating in desperate arcs. Reputation meant nothing now. Fear had stripped away the professional killer, leaving only a frightened man. In the dark. Where are you? He screamed. Where? Here. The word came from behind him. Cortez spun, impossibly fast, his gun already firing, but McGraw was faster. The Mexican's final shot went wild as McGraw's bullet found his heart. He died with surprise in his eyes, never understanding how one old man had destroyed his entire team. Sheriff Wade found McGraw sitting on the saloon porch, reloading his Colt with unhurried precision. 12 bodies lay in the street, their blood black in the moonlight. Jesus Christ, Wade whispered. How? They were good, McGraw said. Quietly, professional, experienced. He snapped the cylinder shut, but they came hunting a man. Should have come hunting a ghost. Dawn revealed the full extent of McGraw's work. Each kill had been methodical, precise. No wasted shots, no random fire. 12 men, 12 bullets. These weren't random gunmen, Wade said, looking at their gear. Custom weapons, military training. Someone spent serious money. Frank Baldwin's opening move. McGraw studied the bodies with clinical detachment. Testing defenses, learning patterns. You think more will come? Many more. He turned to Wade. Time to choose sides, Sheriff. These men had letters of marque, official papers. Next batch will too. Wade's face hardened. Official from who? Territorial. Governor's office, Judge Martin's court, men who've been backing the Baldwins all along. Christ. Wade removed his badge, studied it in the morning light. 12 years as sheriff. Thought I was upholding the law. Law's just words on paper, McGraw said. Justice is something else. They buried the hunters at the edge of town, in unmarked graves. By sunset, word of the midnight slaughter had spread across 3 counties. Frank Baldwin's gold bought him more gunmen, but now they came with doubt in their hearts. They whispered about the ghost marshal, the man who could kill 12 professionals without taking a scratch, the legend who moved like smoke and struck like lightning. But legends, as Copper Creek would soon learn, cut both ways. For every story about McGraw's skill, another arose about Frank Baldwin's vengeance. For every tale of the Ghost Marshal's justice, whispers spread about the army of killers gathering. In the east, the storm was still coming, and these 12 bodies were just the first drops of rain. The day after the midnight slaughter, Whitaker's grandson Jimmy watched McGraw clean his Colt. The boy's eyes fixed on those weathered hands, noting how they moved with the same precision that had dropped 12 men. "Teach me," Jimmy said suddenly. McGraw didn't look up. "Ask your grandfather." Already did. The boy's jaw set stubbornly. He said, "Ask you." Now McGraw looked up, studying the young face. He saw the same quiet rage he'd once seen in another boy's eyes. His son's eyes, before Gettysburg. "Why?" "Because they killed my pa." Jimmy's voice cracked. 3 years ago. Said it was a mining accident, but he never worked the mines. He was asking questions about missing cattle. McGraw reassembled the Colt with 3 quick movements. Learning to shoot won't bring him back. No, but it might keep them from killing anyone else's pa. The words hung in the morning air. Finally McGraw nodded. "Tomorrow, dawn, bring your grandfather's Winchester." Word spread. By the next morning, 6 more young men waited behind Whitaker's store. Sons of men who'd died in accidents, brothers of women who'd fled Baldwin terror, boys forced to become men under the shadow of fear. McGraw taught them more than shooting, taught them to read tracks, to move silent, to watch shadows, taught them the patience that had helped him hunt Frank Baldwin across 12 years and 3 territories. Wade brought news from the east. Frank Baldwin had reached Santa Fe, was gathering men, not just gunfighters now, but former soldiers. Confederate veterans bitter about the peace, Union deserters turned mercenary, men who knew tactics and strategy. 20 riders spotted near Fort Stanton, the sheriff reported. More coming from Texas. They're offering gold and pardons, signed by territorial judges. McGraw cleaned his gun, that same methodical rhythm. "How's Buck healing?" "Fever's broken. Webb says he might live, won't ever walk right. And Billy? Wrists mending, still crazy with hate, keeps talking about some flag." McGraw's hands stilled briefly. "Keep them alive. We'll need witnesses later." Sarah Connor brought more allies. Women who'd lost husbands to Baldwin violence, shopkeepers who'd paid protection money, farmers driven from their land. They came. Quietly, one by one, to Ma Tanner's boarding house. "We can't shoot like you," Sarah told McGraw, "but we can watch. Listen, remember." A network formed, eyes on every street, ears in every saloon. Information flowing to McGraw through casual words and secret signs. They brought him maps, drawings of Baldwin holdings, lists of corrupt officials, James Connor's investigation, pieced together by those who'd helped him. The pattern emerged. Frank Baldwin wasn't just a criminal. He was a weapon wielded by powerful men to seize land along the coming railroad. Copper Creek was one piece in a larger game, but games could be played both ways. McGraw sent telegrams, called in old debts, reached out to men who remembered him from the war, from the Ghost Marshal days, men who owed him favors or shared his taste for justice. Some came openly. 3 former deputies, 2 Apache scouts, a one-eyed bounty hunter named Mason who'd ridden with McGraw in Kansas. Others worked unseen. A clerk in the territorial office started copying documents. A telegrapher began intercepting messages. A cavalry sergeant at Fort Stanton watched troop movements. The town changed too. Wade deputized Whitaker's boys, gave them badges that meant something again. Webb started training women to treat wounds, prepare for the fighting ahead. The Chinese laundress, Mrs. Chen, offered her back room for secret meetings. But not everyone chose sides. Some left town, taking what they could carry. Others watched and waited, ready to join whichever side proved stronger. A few sent messages east, warning Frank Baldwin about McGraw's preparations. McGraw let them run, let them talk, let them betray. Each action, each choice, told him something. About the enemies gathering against Copper Creek, Mason brought word from Fort Stanton. Frank Baldwin had 50 men now, guns, ammunition, even a small cannon taken from a Mexican bandit. They drilled like soldiers, practiced artillery strikes. This ain't just about revenge anymore, Mason warned. They're planning a war. McGraw watched his young students practice reloading, their hands growing faster each day. Already is a war. Has been since they first started stealing land. Difference is, now they're bringing an army. Numbers don't matter much to a ghost, but numbers weren't the only weapon Frank Baldwin had gathered. Judge Martin issued warrants for McGraw's arrest. The territorial governor declared Copper Creek in rebellion. Army patrols were ordered to support law enforcement actions. Wade threw the warrants in his stove. 12 years wearing this badge, never knew how dirty it was. McGraw checked his Colt sight for the 100th time. Law's just a paper, justice is led. At night, from Ma Tanner's window, he watched his students patrol the town's shadows. Young men learning to be ghosts. Women carrying hidden guns, shopkeepers who'd found their courage, a town transforming itself from victim to warrior. But in the east, another transformation was taking place. Frank Baldwin's army grew daily. 50 men became 60, then 70. Hired killers became organized soldiers. Vengeance became military precision. The storm was building. And when it broke, it would break with cannon fire and masked riders and the full power of corrupt law. McGraw rolled a cigarette with one hand, a trick learned in too many ambush spots. Let them come with their numbers, their artillery, their paper justice. He'd spent 12 years becoming a legend. Time to show them why legends are written in blood. Buck Baldwin's fever broke on a moonless night. He woke to find McGraw sitting beside his bed, cleaning that pearl-handled Colt. Come to finish it? Buck's voice was weak, but the hate burned strong. Not yet. McGraw didn't look up from his work. First, you're going to tell me about tall trees. Buck's face went slack. Frank said you'd ask about that. 14 settlers, 3 families, 2 children. McGraw's hands never stopped their methodical movement. You were there. War was over. We were hungry, lost. Sweat beaded on Buck's forehead. Frank said they had gold, said it would be easy. Wasn't. Just gold you took. Buck closed his eyes. Frank went crazy, started cutting people, making them scream, said he learned it from Quantrill's raiders. In the corner, Wade wrote everything down, his face gray. The confession they'd waited for, finally spilling out in the midnight hour. We tried to stop him. Buck whispered. Me and Jed. But he had that look. Same look he got later when he'd hurt people for fun. Said we were weak. Said the strong take what they want. McGraw's hands stilled. And the little girl? Jesus. Buck turned away. Don't make me... Her name was Sarah. McGraw's voice could have frozen hell. Sarah McGraw, my granddaughter. She was 6. Wade's pencil stopped. The room went dead silent. She was visiting her uncle, my son, when you hit the wagon train. He died trying to save her. Combat veteran, 3 battles, killed by deserters too cowardly to face armed men. Buck, Baldwin began to weep. I didn't know. Frank never told us you were... that she was. Now you know. McGraw stood. Now you know why I've hunted 12 years. Why your brother runs. Why this all ends in blood. He left Buck sobbing in the dark. Outside, Mason waited with fresh coffee and old memories. Shouldn't have told him, the one-eyed bounty hunter said. Man deserves to die ignorant, needs to understand. McGraw took the coffee. They all need to understand. They walked the empty streets, past Whitaker's boys standing guard, past Sarah Connor's network of watchers. The town slept uneasily, waiting for the storm to break. Frank Scott. 80 men now, Mason reported. Artillery positioned on the hills east. Scouts watching every road, building firing positions. Good ground for defense, McGraw nodded. He learned something in 12 years. Learned from you. Running so long, man picks up tricks. They stopped at the graveyard. McGraw's eyes found the marker for James Connor, the marshal who died asking questions. Frank's pattern never changed, he said quietly. Tall trees, Fort Smith, every town they took, always the same. Terror, corruption, murder dressed as accident, using fear to steal land, using law to hide crimes. This time's different, Mason observed. This time he's got an army. No. McGraw's voice was cold as mountain snow. This time he's got nothing left to lose. Knows I won't stop hunting. Knows his secrets are out, so he's making his stand. Dawn painted the eastern hills gold. Somewhere out there Frank Baldwin was planning his attack. 80 men, artillery, 12 years of hate. But hate ran both ways. In Webb's clinic, Billy Baldwin nursed his broken wrist and his broken pride. McGraw found him studying the folded flag, trying to understand. Your brother knew, McGraw said from the doorway. Knew what that flag meant. Why I carried it. Sent you to grab it anyway. Billy's young face twisted. You're lying. Frank wouldn't. Sacrifice his own brother. Ask Buck about tall trees. Ask him what Frank did to his own kin. The boy's hands trembled. Why are you telling me this? Because you're young enough to learn, to understand what your brother really is, what he's made you become. He left Billy with those thoughts, with that flag, with the weight of truth crushing. His world. The Telegraph brought more news. Frank Baldwin's army had grown again. 90 men now, former soldiers, professional killers, men who knew siege warfare. They were coming to erase Copper Creek, to bury its secrets, to end the legend of the Ghost Marshal. But legends don't die easily. In Martana's boarding house, McGraw cleaned his Colt one final time. The pearl grips were smoother now, worn by 12 years of hunting. 12 years of planning, 12 years of holding that memory of a little girl's smile, turned to screams by Frank Baldwin's knife. The storm was coming, and this time it would end where it began, in blood. The U.S. Marshal's badge caught the morning sun as David Chapman rode into Copper Creek. Unlike the corrupt territorial lawman, Chapman carried 30 years of honest service in his weathered face. He'd known McGraw during the war, fought beside him in 2 campaigns. Now he'd come to arrest him. Wish it was different, John, Chapman said, sitting across from McGraw in the saloon. His coffee grew cold, untouched. Federal warrant, signed by the Attorney General himself. McGraw studied his old friend's face. You read the charges. Murder, insurrection, interfering with railroad interests. Chapman's mouth twisted on the last words. They're painting you as a killer, stopping progress. keeping civilization from reaching the frontier. Civilization, McGraw's voice dripped contempt. That what you call Frank Baldwin's kind of progress? Found some interesting things about Baldwin. Chapman pulled out a folder. Land deals across 3 territories. All the same pattern: violence, corruption, suddenly abandoned properties. He bought cheap, railroad routes mysteriously changing after he acquires land. Following the money, goes high. Senate committee members, territorial governors, men who can turn cavalry patrols blind and make federal marshals dance to their tune. Wade, listening nearby, spat on the floor. That why you're here, dancing to their tune? Chapman's eyes hardened. I'm here because if I'm not, they'll send someone else. Someone who won't listen. Someone who'll bring troops and start a war. War's already coming, McGraw said quietly. Frank Baldwin's got nearly 100 men in the hills, artillery, supplies for a siege. Jesus, Chapman ran a hand through his gray hair. You're sure about Tall Trees? About what he did? Got Buck Baldwin's confession. Written and witnessed. Got records of other massacres too. Evidence of judges taking bribes, territorial officials helping cover it up. The marshal studied his cold coffee. That's what Connor found, isn't it? Why they killed him. Part of it. He also found telegraph. Records, money transfers, names of men in Washington who've gotten rich helping Baldwin steal land. Outside, Whitaker's boys drilled with their rifles. Sarah Connor's network of watchers maintained their vigil. The town prepared for war while 2 old lawmen discussed justice. They'll kill everyone, Chapman said finally. Not just you. The whole town. Can't leave witnesses, not with what you know. Counting on it. McGraw's voice was cold. Fighting for their lives, people find courage, find strength, found something else. Chapman slid a paper across the table. Military telegraph. Frank Baldwin's got a new ally. Colonel Marcus Reed, cashiered from the army for brutality, specializes in pacifying civilian populations. McGraw's eyes narrowed. Reed heard of him. Burned 3 towns in Kansas during the war. Called it removing rebel support. He's bringing more men. Veterans who served under him. Another 50 guns at least. Wade whistled softly. 150 against our 40? Those ain't good odds. Numbers don't matter to ghosts, McGraw stood. What's your play here, David? Chapman sighed heavily. Got orders to arrest you. Take you to Santa Fe for trial. Try, you mean? Yeah. The marshal stood too. Reckon I'll have to. The 2 men faced each other across decades of friendship and duty. Chapman's hand drifted toward his gun. Could draw, McGraw said quietly. Find out if you're faster than you were in '63. Probably not. Could shoot you anyway. Add another charge to that warrant. Chapman nodded. Could. Instead, McGraw poured fresh coffee. Or could tell you what really happened at Tall Trees. All of it. Then let you decide what justice means. For 3 hours they talked. McGraw laid out the evidence, not just about Frank Baldwin's crimes, but about the powerful men behind him, the corrupt officials, the bought judges, the senators growing, rich on stolen land. Chapman listened, his face growing darker with each revelation. When McGraw finished, the marshal stood and walked to the window. Watch the town preparing for siege. They'll come for your badge, McGraw said. If you don't, bring me in. Let them. Chapman turned back. Wore it 30 years. Maybe time it meant something again. He took out the warrant, lit it with a match. I'll wire Washington. Tell them you were gone when I arrived. Buy you some time. They'll send others. Yes. Chapman headed for the door. But they'll send them. Too late. Something's going to happen here. Something that'll make a lot of powerful men very nervous. He paused. Need help? Still pretty good with a rifle. McGraw shook his head. Need you alive. Need someone to take those records to Washington when it's over. Someone they can't ignore. Records might not be enough. Might need witnesses too. That's why we're keeping Buck and Billy Baldwin alive. Why we're gathering every piece of evidence, every confession. Chapman nodded slowly. Building more than just a defense here, aren't you? Building a noose for some very important necks. Justice comes in many forms. The marshal mounted up, took one last look at the town. Frank Baldwin's not the only ghost. From tall trees, is he? That little girl's ghost has been driving you all these years. McGraw's face might have been carved from stone. Some ghosts don't rest until justice is done. And after? What then? After doesn't matter. Chapman rode, out as the sun westered. Behind him, Copper Creek continued its preparations. Young men learned to shoot, to move like shadows. Women stockpiled medical supplies and ammunition. Old grievances were set aside as the town united against the coming storm. But storm clouds weren't just gathering in the east. Telegraph wires hummed with urgent messages. Powerful men made desperate plans. Frank Baldwin's army was just the beginning. The real war was about to begin. Billy Baldwin made his choice at midnight. He limped into Martana's boarding house, cradling his still-healing wrist, and placed a stack of papers on McGraw's table. Frank's private letters, he said quietly. Been collecting them for years. Never knew why, just felt wrong throwing them away. McGraw studied the boy's face. Why now? Asked Buck about tall trees. Billy's voice cracked. About what Frank did to that little girl, your granddaughter. The papers revealed Frank Baldwin's true nature. Letters gloating about murders disguised as accidents. Lists of bribes paid to officials. Details of land stolen from widows and orphans. He used us, Billy whispered. His own brothers. Sent me to grab that flag, knowing what it meant. Knowing what you'd do. McGraw's fingers traced the worn blue fabric. He wanted you, dead. Remove witnesses. Leave him clean, like he did at Tall Trees, killing his own men to hide the truth. You're learning. Dawn found them still talking. Billy poured out 12 years of secrets, of doubts, of watching his brother's cruelty grow. McGraw listened, weighing each word, building his case against not just Frank Baldwin, but the powerful men behind him. Sarah Connor brought coffee and news. Telegraph line to Santa Fe is dead. Frank's men cut it last night. Isolating us, McGraw nodded. Standard siege tactics. Army patrol turned back a supply wagon too. Said they had orders about restricting support to insurrectionists. Wade arrived with more complications. 3 prominent townsmen had fled in the night, taking what they could carry. Others were wavering, seeing the odds mount against them. Can't blame them, the sheriff said. Frank's got half the territory's law on his side. Got the army looking the other way. Got enough guns to take 3 towns. Let them run. McGraw cleaned his Colt with those same methodical movements. Fear shows who people really are. But for every coward who fled, someone else found courage. Doc Webb organized the women into nursing teams, teaching them to treat gunshot wounds. Mrs. Chen's laundry became an arsenal, rifle parts hidden among the linens. Whitaker's boys grew deadlier each day. McGraw taught them Apache scout tricks, ways to move unseen, to kill silently. They weren't just farm boys anymore. They were becoming ghosts. Mason brought word from his network of scouts. Frank Baldwin's army had grown again, now nearly 200 strong. Colonel Reed had arrived with his veterans, bringing military discipline to the mob of killers. They're building firing positions, the one-eyed bounty hunter reported. Getting ready for a proper siege. Reed's even got a Gatling gun. McGraw's only reaction was to check his ammunition. Changes nothing, changes everything, Mason argued. This ain't just manhunters anymore. These are soldiers. They know siege warfare. Good. McGraw's eyes were cold. Soldiers die just like anyone else. But the pressure wasn't just military. Judge Martin issued more warrants, declaring anyone who helped McGraw a traitor. The territorial governor ordered all banks to freeze Copper Creek accounts. Supply wagons were stopped, mail diverted. The town began to feel the squeeze. Food grew scarce. Ammunition had to be carefully counted. Every day brought more tension, more doubt. Then Buck Baldwin made his choice. They found him in Webb's clinic, throat cut with surgical precision. On his bed lay a confession, written in his own hand, detailing every crime the Baldwins had committed. Every murder, every theft, every name of every corrupt official who'd helped them. Frank's man did it, Webb said grimly. Caught him trying to burn the confession. He won't try anything else, ever. The dead assassin lay in the corner, Webb's scalpel still in his throat. Buck's death changed things. His written testimony, now sealed and secured, gave them legal weapons to match their guns. But it also showed Frank Baldwin's desperation. He's burning his bridges, McGraw told Wade. Can't go back now. Too many powerful men want him silenced. The sheriff examined the confession. This'll hang half the territorial government. If we live to use it. More changes came. The army patrol that had turned back their supplies suddenly disappeared, replaced by more sympathetic troops. The new commander, a young lieutenant named Phillips, had read the territorial dispatches too carefully. Orders say, "Don't help insurrectionists," Phillips told McGraw. "Don't see any insurrection here, just honest folks defending their homes." The telegraph line mysteriously repaired itself. Marshal Chapman's influence, perhaps, or other honest men choosing sides. But the biggest change came from Billy Baldwin. The youngest brother asked to address the town, standing on the saloon's porch, with his arm in a sling. "My whole life," he told the crowd, "I thought Frank was a hero, thought he was protecting us, making us strong. Now I know he's just a killer, a coward who murders children and betrays his own blood." His voice grew stronger. "I aim to make it right, aim to testify about everything he's done, everything I've seen, and I aim to help defend this town against him." McGraw watched from the shadows as the town absorbed this shift, saw hope kindle in tired eyes, saw spines straighten and jaws set. With new determination, Frank Baldwin's army might number hundreds, but armies can be broken. His political allies might be powerful, but power built on corruption can fall. The real strength was here, in people choosing to stand, in a town finding its courage, in justice that wouldn't die. The storm was coming, but now, with each shifting loyalty, each chosen side, the lightning had new targets to strike. Mason found McGraw at his granddaughter's unmarked grave, the old gunfighter's face carved from shadow in the dying light. A bottle of whiskey sat untouched between them. "Tell me about Kansas," Mason said quietly. "About how you got that name." "The Ghost Marshal," McGraw's eyes never left the grave, "was after tall trees, after I started hunting them. Word got around, men dying in their sleep, killers found without a mark, corrupt sheriffs vanishing on empty roads. Did that myself, the vanishing part, year after you saved my worthless hide. Remember that day, you facing down 4 men, already missing the eye they took." Mason touched his patch. "Learned from you, about patience, about making fear work. For you." The whiskey remained unopened as McGraw spoke of those years, of tracking deserters through Apache country, of teaching himself to move like smoke, to kill like winter, quiet and cold and inevitable. "They started lighting lanterns," he said, "every night, thinking light would keep the ghost away, never learned that darkness was their friend. I was worse in daylight. Sarah Connor brought coffee, sat listening as 2 killers talked of death, her own rage burning since her husband's murder, found kinship in their cold vengeance. Frank Baldwin wasn't the worst," McGraw continued, "just the one who got away. Others died easier. Judge Kane, who took bribes to free murderers, found hanging in his own courthouse. Marshal Pierce, who sold badges to killers, dead in a whorehouse with his own gun in his mouth. Heard about Pierce," Mason nodded. "Never knew that was you." "Sometimes. The law needs cleaning, like a gun gets fouled. Need to strip it down, burn out the corruption." More listeners gathered as night fell. Whitaker's boys, learning that violence had principles. Webb, understanding that healing sometimes required destruction. Wade, seeing how justice and law weren't always the same. McGraw spoke of Nebraska, of tracking corrupt cattle barons who'd murdered homesteaders, of teaching himself to shoot with either hand, to hit targets by sound alone, to become the terror that killers feared. 7 men in Lincoln, he said, all hired guns, all protecting. A man who'd built his fortune on blood, found them in a poker game. Lights went out. When they came back on, 8 men dead at the table. 8? Wade asked. Dealer was taking bribes, telling killers when witnesses would be alone. The stories continued as stars wheeled overhead. Tales of justice dealt from gun barrels, of corruption burned out like snakebite poison, of a man becoming legend one death at a time. Tell them about the canyon, Mason said finally. About what you did to Quantrill's old bunch. McGraw's face hardened. Some stories don't need telling. This one does. They need to understand what's coming, what you really are. Silence stretched. Finally, McGraw spoke. 23 men. Raiders, who'd turned killer after the war, led by Quantrill's former lieutenant, hiding in a box canyon, thinking they were safe. His voice grew distant, remembering. Took me 3 days. No sleep, no rest, just killing, one by one. Let them see their friends die, never knowing where the shot came from. Let them huddle together, jumping at shadows. Wade refilled coffee cups with shaking hands. Last night they were burning their dead. Down to 6 men. Their leader, Tom Quantrill himself, started shooting his own boys. Said I was inside there. Heads. Said death was catching. How'd it end? Billy Baldwin asked softly. Found Quantrill at dawn. Sitting alone, gun empty, talking to ghosts. Said he remembered me from the war. Said he'd seen what I'd done to raiders. Begged me to make it quick. Did you? McGraw's eyes were cold as prairie winter. No. The night grew older. More stories emerged. The Wyoming Range War, where McGraw had killed 11 men in 11 minutes. The New Mexico bank robbery, where would-be thieves were found stretched along 50 miles of trail. Always the same pattern, Mason observed. Hunting bad men, making them afraid. Using terror like a weapon. Fear's a tool, McGraw agreed. Like any other, learn to use it, learn to spread it. Make them hunt shadows while death comes in daylight. Billy Baldwin shivered. That's what you're planning here? Making them afraid? No. McGraw finally opened. The whiskey. Here it ends, all of it. The hunting, the killing, the ghosts. Frank Baldwin dies in Copper Creek, and all his powerful friends learn what real fear tastes like. He poured drinks, passed them around, a ceremony of sorts, a communion of killers and victims and those caught between. Tomorrow they'll start, moving into position. Colonel Reed knows siege warfare. Frank knows my reputation. They'll come careful, come prepared. Won't matter, Mason said quietly. No. McGraw's voice was death itself. Won't matter at all. Dawn broke over Copper Creek, painting the town in blood colors. From the hills came the rumble of moving guns, the thunder of hooves. Frank Baldwin's army was coming, but they weren't hunting a man anymore. They were hunting a ghost. And ghosts, as Copper Creek would soon learn, had ways of hunting back. Lieutenant Phillips arrived at midnight, his cavalry uniform stained with blood. 2 bullets had creased his arm, and his horse was lathered with desperate riding. They knew, he gasped, as Webb tended his wounds. Somehow they knew about the supply cache, the extra ammunition, the medical supplies, all gone. McGraw's face showed nothing, but his hand tightened on the pearl-gripped Colt. Ambush? Professional job. 20 men, military-trained. They had the exact location. Even knew about the false bottom in the supply wagon. Only 6 people had known about those supplies. Only 6 had known the route, the timing, the hidden compartments. How many dead? Wade asked. 4 of my men, good boys. Never even got a shot off. In the corner, Sarah Connor went pale. Her hands trembled as she poured coffee, sloshing dark liquid across the table. McGraw watched her with dead eyes. "When did you start working for Frank?" The coffee pot shattered on the floor. Sarah's hand moved for the derringer in her pocket, but McGraw was already there, his grip like iron on her wrist. "James," she whispered. "He's alive. Frank has him. Said if I helped." The room went silent. Wade's face showed pure betrayal. Webb stopped bandaging Phillips, needle frozen in mid-stitch. "James Connor's been dead 3 months. McGraw's voice could have frozen hell. "Found his grave last week. Shallow, recent, but dead all the same." Sarah sagged in his grip. "No, they showed me letters, proof. Said he was in a mining camp. Said if I helped them, gave them information." "They showed you what they wanted you to see. Used your hope against you, against all of us." Tears streaked her face. "I had to try, had to know." "How long?" 2 weeks, since Billy changed sides. Frank's man approached me, said James was asking for me." McGraw's grip gentled slightly. "What did you tell them?" "Everything. The supplies, the defensive positions, the evidence you've gathered." Her voice broke. "The names of everyone helping you, everyone in the network." Wade cursed softly. 3 months of preparation, of building trust and gathering intelligence, all compromised. "They'll hit the weak points first," Phillips said. "Target your supporters. Eliminate anyone who might testify later." Already happening, Mason appeared in the doorway. "Fire at Whitaker's store. Chinese laundry, too. They're moving fast." McGraw released Sarah's wrist. "Sound the alarm. Get everyone to fallback positions." Not enough time. Wade headed for the door. Not enough men to cover. Gunfire erupted in the street. Screams followed. Frank Baldwin's army wasn't waiting for dawn. "They're inside the perimeter," Mason reported. "Multiple teams, moving like military units." Sarah Connor collapsed, horror dawning as she realized what she'd done. How many would die because she'd believed a lie? "Lock her up," McGraw ordered. "Post guards." "John," she pleaded, "I never meant—" "I know." His voice held no mercy. "That's why you'll live to see what your betrayal costs. More gunfire, more screams. The night filled with the sound of Frank Baldwin's killers moving through. "Copper Creek streets, we need to evacuate," Wade argued. "Save who we can." "No." McGraw checked his Colt with those same methodical movements. "This changes nothing. Changes everything. They know our plans, our positions, know what we wanted them to know." The room went quiet. Mason's one eye widened slightly. Sarah wasn't the only one feeding information, McGraw continued. "Been laying false trails since I arrived, building a trap within a trap." Understanding dawned in Phillips's face. The supply cache. It was bait? "Everything's bait. Every defensive position," she revealed. "Every fallback point, every piece of evidence." McGraw's smile held no warmth. "Even the betrayal we knew was coming." Wade stared. "You knew about Sarah?" "Watched Frank's man approach her. Watched hope blind her to obvious lies. So we fed her what we wanted Frank to know." Outside, the gunfire grew closer. But now, listening closely, they heard something else. The sound of Frank Baldwin's men dying as they walked into prepared kill zones. Into ambushes laid by men who'd spent weeks learning to move like ghosts. "Let them come." McGraw headed for the door. "Let them think they've won. Let them push deeper into town, following the plans they think they know." Mason grinned savagely. "While our real positions, our real plans, remain in shadow, where ghosts do their best work." Sarah Connor wept in her cell, understanding too late that her betrayal had been just another weapon in McGraw's arsenal, another piece in his grand trap. The night exploded into violence as 200 men assaulted a town of 40 defenders. But numbers meant nothing when every street was a killing ground. Every shadow held death, and the ghost they hunted had been hunting them all along. Frank Baldwin's army was about to learn the difference between knowing a legend's plans and understanding a legend's mind. Colonel Reed watched his men die through his brass telescope. 15 veterans, cut down in 3 minutes without firing a shot. Just shadows in the dark, then blood on the streets. Impossible, he muttered. They knew exactly where we'd be, like they could read my mind. Behind him, Frank Baldwin studied a map of Copper Creek, his face illuminated by lantern light. McGraw's getting better with age, more cunning. No. Reed lowered the telescope. This is different. Every move we make, they're waiting. Every position we take, they've prepared for. Almost like... He stopped, turned slowly to face Baldwin. Almost. Like someone's been feeding them our plans, Frank finished. Someone who knows how we think, how we plan assaults. Reed's hand moved toward his gun. You son of a... 2 shots cracked in the darkness. Reed's chest erupted red. He stumbled backward, surprise replacing rage on his weathered face. Sorry, Colonel. Frank's gun smoked in the lamplight, but a good commander always has a backup plan. As Reed collapsed, more shadows detached themselves from the night. 30 men, moving with military precision, but not Reed's men, not the ordinary killers and hired guns. These were different, harder, colder, men who'd learned to kill in worse places than the American frontier. Right on schedule. Frank holstered his gun. McGraw will have his trappers watching the east approaches, expecting us to follow Reed's plan, while our real force comes from the west, one of the new men finished in a clipped British accent. Through the box canyon, he thinks is impassable. Pincer movement, another added. His German accent marked him as one of the mercenaries Frank had recruited from Europe. Like we used in Prussia. Frank smiled coldly. Reed was always the decoy. Him and his predictable tactics, his men dying out there are just a distraction. In town, McGraw's carefully laid traps were working perfectly. Too perfectly. Frank's men walked into prepared kill zones exactly as expected, died exactly where planned. Only Mason saw the pattern. Found McGraw in the church tower, watching the eastern approaches. It's wrong, the one-eyed bounty hunter said. They're dying too easy. Frank Baldwin's smarter than this. McGraw's eyes never left the street below. Notice who's dying? Reed's men. The Americans. The ones we knew about. Mason's eye widened. Sweet Jesus, where are the others? The foreign. Ones Frank was recruiting, coming through the box canyon, right about now. That's impossible. Those cliffs, not with proper climbing gear, not with men trained in mountain warfare. McGraw checked his Colt. Frank's been planning this longer than we thought. Reed was always a sacrifice. Gunfire erupted from the west. Screams followed. Frank Baldwin's real assault had begun. In her cell, Sarah Connor heard boots on the stairs. The door opened to reveal Billy Baldwin, his broken wrist still in a sling. Time to go, he said, unlocking her cell. What? Frank sent me here months ago, before McGraw arrived. Been working for him all along. Billy's young face showed no emotion. Even letting McGraw break my wrist was part of the plan. Sarah stared. But the confession, the evidence, all fake. Designed to make McGraw trust me, to make him think he'd turned me. Billy gestured with his gun. Move. He'll kill you for this. No. Billy's smile was cold as his brother's. He won't, because Frank's got one more surprise. One more betrayal even the great ghost marshal never saw coming. In the church tower, McGraw and Mason watched Frank's elite killers sweep through Copper Creek's western streets, 30 professionals against 40 half-trained defenders. Need to fall back, Mason said. Regroup at the courthouse. No. McGraw's voice held something Mason had never heard before, something almost like satisfaction. This is exactly what we wanted. We wanted to be outflanked by professional killers, wanted them all in one place, all the real threats. All Frank's best men, McGraw smiled thinly, all the ones worth killing. Understanding dawned in Mason's eye. You knew about Frank's plan, about Reed being a decoy. You wanted them to come through the box canyon, because that's where the dynamite is, where the charges have been waiting, where 30 of the best killers in Europe are about to learn why you don't trap a ghost. The night shook with thunder as the box canyon exploded. Frank Baldwin's elite force vanished in fire and stone, buried under tons of rock. But even as the echoes died, even as McGraw's trap closed on Frank's best men, Billy Baldwin was leading Sarah Connor through underground tunnels, toward one final revelation that would change everything. The ghost might be cunning, but some betrayals cut deeper than others. Some secrets were darker than any shadow, and Frank Baldwin had saved his deadliest weapon for last. The tunnels beneath Copper Creek were older than the town itself. Mining shafts, some said, Indian caves, others claimed. But as Billy Baldwin led Sarah Connor through the darkness, she realized they were something else entirely. Escape routes, she whispered, built into the town from the beginning. Smart woman. Billy's gun never wavered. Frank had them dug when he first came here. 6 months before the Baldwins officially arrived, years before McGraw started hunting him. He planned. All this, the whole thing, every piece, the land grabs, the corrupt officials, the terror campaign. Billy's voice held pride. Even McGraw coming here, especially that. The tunnel opened into a larger chamber. Lanterns illuminated faces Sarah recognized, townspeople who'd fled earlier. But they weren't refugees. Their eyes were hard. Their hands held weapons with familiar ease, and in the center stood a ghost. "Hello, Sarah," James Connor said quietly. "Sorry about the deception." Her world tilted. Her dead husband stood before her, very much alive, but his eyes weren't the eyes she remembered. They were cold now, empty. "You're working for Frank." Not a question. Other way around. James smiled thinly. "Frank works for me. Always has. Since, before Tall Trees, the truth hit her like a physical blow. You're the one behind everything. Had to clean up the territory, remove the weak elements, make room for progress." He spoke like a teacher explaining simple math. Frank and his brothers were useful tools. McGraw was a useful enemy. The massacre at Tall Trees, necessary, had to give McGraw a reason to hunt Frank, to build his legend, to become the ghost everyone feared. James stepped closer, because legends can be used, can be pointed at targets, can be brought to specific places at specific times. Sarah backed away, bumping into Billy's gun. All those people, that little girl. Sacrifices for a greater cause. This territory needs strong men, men willing to do what's necessary. James gestured at the armed figures around them. These men understand that, like Frank understands it, like you'll understand it too. You're insane. I'm practical. McGraw's legend keeps other predators away. His reputation protects our interests. But now he knows too much, has too much evidence. James's voice hardened. Time for the ghost to die. Above them, McGraw and Mason were discovering the final betrayal. The courthouse records, their carefully gathered evidence, gone. Wade and Webb missing. Whitaker's boys cut off and surrounded. "Pulled us too thin," Mason said grimly. "Used our own tactics against us." McGraw watched Frank Baldwin's remaining. Forces converge on the town square. No longer trying to hide, no longer following Reed's predictable plans. "Not Frank's tactics," he said quietly. "Someone else, someone who thinks bigger." Who? Before McGraw could answer, movement caught his eye. A familiar figure stepping into the lamplight. James Connor, Sarah's dead husband, the missing marshal, and suddenly everything made sense. "Hello, John," Connor called out. "Been a while. About 12 years, I'd say. Since Tall Trees." The night went silent. Even the gunfire seemed to hold its breath. "You were there." McGraw's voice could have frozen flame. "Watching, directing, planning, using Frank's appetites for my own purposes." Connor smiled. "Had to. Give you a reason, you see. Something personal, something that would turn you into what I needed." Mason's eye widened. Mother of God, Frank was useful, still is. But you, John, you were my masterpiece, the ghost who haunted other predators, the legend that kept order through fear. Connor spread his hands. The perfect weapon. McGraw's gun hand hadn't moved, hadn't even twitched. But death lived in his eyes now. My granddaughter. Regrettable, but necessary. Personal loss focuses a man, gives him purpose. Connor's voice held no remorse. Look what it made you. Look what you became. Around them more figures emerged. Townspeople McGraw had trusted. Men he'd trained. All Connor's people planted months or years before. Your evidence is gone, Connor continued. Your allies are dead or captured. Your carefully laid plans have crumbled. He smiled again. All that's left is the ghost. And ghosts, as you taught. Us can die. Frank Baldwin stepped into the light, his own gun trained on McGraw. Other weapons followed, 30, 40 guns aimed at the legendary killer. You were right about one thing, Connor said. Legends are written in blood. Time to write your final chapter. But McGraw didn't look at the guns, didn't look at Frank. Baldwin's savage grin or Connor's satisfied smile, he looked at the stars, where dawn was still hours away. You're right, too, he said quietly. About legends, about blood. His eyes came down, colder than mountain winter. But you forgot something. Important. Oh? Ghosts don't need evidence, don't need allies, don't need plans. McGraw's voice could have carved stone. They just need darkness and death. His hand hadn't moved, but somehow, suddenly, his gun was aimed at Connor's heart, and we've got hours of darkness left. Copper Creek held its breath. 40 guns aimed at McGraw's heart, yet no one moved. Even Frank Baldwin, for all his hate, waited for Connor's word. Still fast, Connor mused. Still deadly. But one gun against 40? Those aren't ghost odds. John, you miscounted. McGraw's voice was soft as a rattler's warning. Mason's got a shot too. Had, Mason called from the shadows, until Billy here put a gun to my back. Sorry, John. Billy Baldwin emerged from the darkness, pushing the one-eyed bounty hunter ahead of him. The young man's broken wrist had healed remarkably well. You taught me about deception, Connor smiled, about patience, about laying traps within traps. He gestured at the armed men surrounding them. These aren't just hired guns, they're my people. Been placing them in towns across the territory for years, building my own legend, quiet and careful, while using mine as cover. Exactly. Every territory needs its ghost stories, its bogeymen to frighten the weak. Connor's voice held genuine admiration. You were perfect, the grieving avenger, the unstoppable killer. While you hunted Frank, my real work continued unopposed. McGraw's gun hadn't wavered. Building an empire, building order, structure. Progress has its price, John. Weak men, weak towns, they have to be cleared away, like dead wood before a fire. The night wind moaned through Copper Creek's empty streets. Somewhere, a door creaked, like the town itself was listening. Could have been part of it, Connor continued. Could have joined us, built something lasting instead of chasing vengeance. Already building something. McGraw's eyes were chips of ice. Your grave, Connor sighed. Always the soldier, never the general. He raised his voice. Wade, show our friend what happens to those who resist progress. Sheriff Wade stepped into the lamplight, pushing Webb ahead of him. The doctor's face was bloody, but his eyes held more shame than pain. Found him burning records, Wade said, trying to save some of the evidence. One by one, Connor's men brought out their captives. Whitaker, hands bound, Mrs. Chen, defiant. Even in defeat, the young men McGraw had trained, disarmed and surrounded. Your pieces are taken, Connor said. Your position lost. Time to end this game. McGraw's gun moved fractionally, centering on Connor's heart. Not a game. No. Connor's smile widened. Then why are you still alive? Why haven't my 40 men fired? Because I want you to understand, to appreciate the elegance of it all. Nothing elegant about murdering children. One child, one death to create a legend. Connor stepped closer, utterly confident. Think of the mathematics. One life traded for a decade of order, for progress that will benefit thousands. Frank Baldwin shifted impatiently. Enough talk. Let me kill him. Patience, Frank. You'll have your revenge. Connor never took his eyes off McGraw. But first he needs to see, to understand that everything, even his vengeance, served my purpose. McGraw's voice was death itself. Only purpose left is killing you. With what army? Connor laughed. Your allies are captured or dead, your evidence destroyed, your reputation about to become another cautionary tale. He spread his arms. The ghost dies tonight. Progress demands it. Progress. McGraw spoke. The word, like a curse. That what you call burning homesteads, murdering families, building your empire on blood? Someone has to decide who lives and dies, who's strong enough to survive. Connor's eyes blazed with zealot's fire. I'm not just some bandit chief, John. I'm the architect of the future, the strong hand that shapes history. No. McGraw's finger tightened imperceptibly on the trigger. You're just another killer, another mad dog needs putting down. Connor's face hardened. Last chance, John. Surrender. Die with dignity. These people you tried to protect might live. Like my granddaughter. Live. That's the problem with ghosts. Connor signaled his men. Too focused on the past, never seeing the future. 40 hammers cocked in unison. 40 fingers tensed on triggers. The night itself seemed to hold its breath. Any last words? Connor asked. Any final understanding of your place in history? McGraw smiled then, a cold smile, a ghost smile. Just one thing, he said softly. Oh? You forgot to count Mason's other gun. Connor's eyes widened a fraction. Too late, he remembered the bounty hunter's reputation. Too late, he recalled that. Mason always carried 2 guns. The one-eyed man's left hand moved like lightning, and the night exploded into blood and thunder. Mason's hidden derringer took Connor's right ear, the sound lost in the chaos that followed. McGraw was moving before the blood hit the ground, his first shot catching Frank Baldwin square in the chest. Then hell itself opened in Copper Creek's streets. McGraw rolled behind a water trough as 40 guns thundered. Mason dropped 3 men with his recovered rifle before diving through a shop window. The night filled with gun smoke and screaming. "Kill them!" Connor howled, blood streaming down his neck. "Kill them all!" But ghosts are harder to kill than men. McGraw's guns spoke twice more. 2 of Connor's shooters fell, their shots going wild. Mason's rifle cracked from a new position, dropping another gunman. "Spread out," Billy Baldwin ordered, trying to organize the chaos. "Circle around." Webb chose that moment to slam his head backward, catching Wade in the face. The sheriff's grip loosened. Webb twisted free, shouting to the other captives, "Now!" Whitaker's boys exploded into action, months of McGraw's training showing. They dropped, rolled, came up with hidden weapons. Connor's men found themselves caught in a deadly crossfire. Impossible! Connor staggered toward cover. They were searched, disarmed. But McGraw had learned from tall trees, had taught his students to hide weapons like the Apache hid war parties. Every captive carried at least 1 hidden gun. The street became a killing ground. Mrs. Chen produced a derringer from her sleeve, shot the man guarding her point blank. Whitaker's cane concealed a sword blade that opened throats with practiced ease. Even Webb had a small pepperbox pistol strapped to his ankle. "Fall back!" Billy Baldwin screamed. "Regroup at the—" McGraw's bullet took him through the throat, ending his performance forever. The young traitor died with surprise in his eyes, never understanding that his broken wrist had healed too cleanly, too quickly. That McGraw had known his betrayal from the start. Frank Baldwin, gut-shot and dying, tried to draw a bead on McGraw. Mason's rifle ended that threat permanently. "The evidence!" Connor shouted to his remaining men. "Burn it all. Leave nothing." But that order came too late as well. Webb's desperate attempt to burn records had been staged. The real documents were long gone, sent to Marshal Chapman through Mrs. Chen's laundry deliveries. McGraw moved like a ghost through the gun smoke. Each shot finding a target. All his fury, all his patience, all his skill, honed by 12 years of hunting, it all came down to this night, this reckoning. Wade tried to run. Whitaker's grandson, Jimmy, dropped him with a rifle shot that would have made McGraw proud. Connor's carefully placed men, his years of planning, his web of corruption, it all unraveled in 7 minutes of pure hell. His shooters were professionals, but they faced opponents who'd trained specifically for this night. Who knew every angle, every shadow, every line of fire in Copper Creek streets, the tunnel. Connor stumbled toward the hidden entrance. Fall back to already blocked. Sarah Connor's voice came from behind him. She held James's own gun, her hands rock steady. Your escape routes are gone, like my marriage, like my trust. She put 2 bullets into her husband's leg. He fell, screaming curses. The shooting began to slacken. Connor's surviving men threw down their weapons, realizing too late they'd been fighting ghosts who knew their every move, who'd planned for this night with the same patience that had tracked Frank Baldwin across 12 years. McGraw moved through the aftermath like death itself, putting down the wounded who still showed fight. No mercy, no hesitation. Just the cold efficiency that had made him legend. Finally, only Connor remained, propped against a hitching post, bleeding from 3 wounds. "Don't you see?" he gasped as McGraw approached. "Everything I did, it was for progress, for the future." McGraw's voice was soft as a funeral prayer. "Future's not yours to decide. Kill me then. Add another ghost to your collection." No. McGraw's gun didn't waver. "Ghosts are for guilty men. You're going to trial, going to hang legal with witnesses and evidence and every piece of your empire exposed." Connor tried to smile through bloody teeth. "Evidence is gone. Witnesses will vanish. My friends in high places are already falling." Mason emerged from the gunsmoke. "Marshal Chapman's been busy. Federal warrants are out. Treasury agents freezing accounts. That evidence you thought was destroyed? Been reaching Washington for weeks." Horror dawned in Connor's eyes as he realized the true depth of his defeat. Not just his men dead, his plans ruined, but his entire corrupt network exposed, the mighty architect of the future brought down by the ghost he'd tried to use. "It's over," McGraw said quietly. "Everything you built, everything you killed for, all of it ends here. Then do it." Connor straightened, seeking one last shred of dignity. "Finish it." McGraw's gun roared one final time. The bullet took Connor's other ear, leaving him alive but forever marked. "Live," McGraw told him coldly. "Live to see it all torn down. Live to watch progress leave you behind. Live to hear the ghost stories. They'll tell about this night." Dawn broke over Copper Creek, painting the streets in colors of blood and justice. 28 of Connor's men lay dead. 12 more sat under guard, awaiting federal marshals. Frank Baldwin's body cooled beside. His treacherous brothers, their long game finally ended. And James Connor, architect of empires, killer of innocence, would live to see his legacy become dust. Would face not a ghost's vengeance, but the law's slow, grinding justice. McGraw watched the sun rise, his gun finally silent. 12 years of hunting, 12 years of building his legend, all to reach this morning, this reckoning. "Worth it?" Mason asked quietly. McGraw thought of his granddaughter, of Frank Baldwin's victims, of all the graves that had marked his path to this dawn. "Worth it," he said softly. "Every ghost, every death, every step." The wind carried away the gun smoke, revealing Copper, Greek streets painted with the justice that legends are made of. And somewhere, perhaps, a little girl's spirit finally found peace. A month after the night of reckoning, Marshal Chapman watched James Connor hang. The architect of corruption died without dignity, cursing McGraw's name as the trap dropped. Federal courts moved swiftly once the evidence emerged. 3 territorial judges faced prison. A senator resigned in disgrace. 28 corrupt officials fled to Mexico. Connor's empire crumbled like the house of cards it had always been. In Copper Creek, changes came more slowly. Bullet holes were patched, buildings rebuilt. New settlers arrived, drawn by tales of a town that had fought back against corruption and won. Wade's badge went to Jimmy Whitaker. The boy who'd learned to shoot from a ghost now upheld the law with quiet strength. His grandfather lived to see him become the youngest sheriff in territorial history. Webb's clinic expanded. His German medical kit treated those who'd once feared Baldwin violence. Sarah Connor worked there too, finding redemption in healing. Others, Mason rode out after a week, carrying McGraw's written testimony to other federal courts. The one-eyed bounty hunter had new purpose now, hunting corrupt officials instead of common outlaws. But the town's greatest change wasn't in its buildings or its laws. It was in its spirit. People walked straighter, spoke clearer, met each other's eyes. They'd faced down evil and survived. Had learned that courage, once found, never truly fades. McGraw left as quietly as he'd arrived. No fanfare, no goodbyes. Just mounted up one dawn and rode east, following the rising sun. Some said he was hunting other corrupt men. Others claimed he'd finally found peace, his vengeance complete. Most figured the truth lay somewhere between, that some ghosts never rest but find purpose in their haunting. His legend grew. Stories spread about the night Connor's empire fell, about 40 guns against one ghost, about justice coming to Copper Creek on a tide of blood and thunder. But in the end, the most lasting change wasn't in the stories people told. It was in the small things. A Chinese laundress who held her head high. A doctor who treated rich and poor alike. Young men who'd learned that courage was stronger than fear. A town that had found its soul again. And sometimes, on quiet nights, people remembered the ghost who taught them to fight back. Who'd turned their fear into strength. Who'd shown them that legends don't just fight evil, they inspire others to stand against it. Copper Creek kept McGraw's pearl-handled Colt hung above the saloon bar, a reminder that justice may sleep but never dies. And somewhere out on the frontier, a ghost still rides, still hunts, still brings terror to those who prey on the weak, because legends once born never truly fade. They just find new battles to fight.